Manet. This is a wonderful little scene because you have to sort of imagine that this woman is on a date with somebody she's not really having a very good time with. Guy's talking about himself all night. And then even in what looks like a traditional religious painting, that's his parents. He doesn't even let them out of the picture. I mean, here they don't even get to look. This is a marvelous painting. And that we could go on. There's plenty more evidence. I don't mean to suggest that Manet alone has any copyright on such looks. They occur elsewhere, like in Whistler's famous The White Girl. And later in Degas, the Café l'Absinthe. It is the extraordinary, as I said before, repetition of the theme in Manet and the fact that the emptiness of the look seems finally to form a type that makes it almost a mythological donné in his work. Once that issue is dramatically in play, every other aspect of the painting becomes a question. In Hegel's terms, an eye, a face, in the same way. Why naked at a picnic? Why are the men talking to each other, and why do they seem to ignore her and not even look at each other? What does the position and gesture of Olympia's left hand mean, given that it's a strange and direct reference to the more provocative and erotic left hand of the Venus d'Urbino? They're very deliberate, no question about that. Maybe I shouldn't leave that on the screen. It's too. And finally, under what historical conditions would this aspect of the painting's meaning, a kind of puzzled resistance to direct appreciation, even a somewhat contemptuous challenge to the beholder's become of meaning, become so thematized and problematic? Clearly, the large problem being addressed here involves working out what it means now, under the conditions of emerging modern capitalism, to paint gallery pictures for beholders who are also buyers. What assumptions about the mindedness of the beholder, their expectations about interpretability and meaning, and the portrayal of human mindedness in the painting are relevant now that various institutional contexts and assumptions no longer inform the interaction between painting and beholder as they once did, and in the rapidly changing context also expressed in modern drama, poetry, and philosophy. Again, this is the country in which Michael Fried's works are relevant and everywhere relevant to these concerns. It's perfectly consistent with Fried's art historical project to emphasize not only this theme as a visual motif, which is what his interest is in, what it is to be a minded corporeal being, what in a sense does it look like, but also to emphasize, as here, that this status can change, even have degrees of attainment and begin to fail. It certainly has something to do with the appropriate portrayal of the mind world and subject-subject relationship in perception, reflection, and action. All of that is at stake. I've claimed that we can begin to develop a Hegelian understanding of post-Hegelian art if we take into account his project as a whole and appreciate the limitations of his diagnosis of modern societies. So let me return again, finally, to the particular qualities of painting as a fine art. This ascription of meaning, as I've been emphasizing when we look at a painting, is not inferential or a two-stage relation. And therewith is painting's great advantage as an art. We don't see bodily movements and then infer intentions in the real world any more than we see painted canvases and infer represented objects and intended meaning. We imaginatively see. We do not see and then imagine. The painting does not mean in our heads. But such intelligibility is the articulation that is an achievement of some sort. Understanding what we see is always in some sense provisional, revisable, especially contestable with others, and that characteristic is now an aspect inherent in seeing or understanding itself in the simplest sense. Not being able to do this with any confidence is what it means for there to be no, in Hegelian terms, reconciliation of spirit with itself. No confident self-understanding in the face of contesting claims or in the face of confusion about how, in such a world, even begin to try. There's one final example of this resistance to easy or direct interpretability in Manet's famous painting of the execution of Maximilian. I mean, there are a number of things that are very strange about the painting. The perspective is all fouled up. There's a relationship to the beholder intimated by the smudges that stand for the beholder on the wall. The relationship of the executioners to the, I think he's having some sort of fun with his critics about being executed by the official forces of order and authority. But the one thing he does when he's finished the painting is add this. Oops. Don't I have that somewhere? Yeah. Interpret that. He just takes his paintbrush, dips it in red paint, and marks it on the canvas. Has no dramatic relationship to the scene at all. So, the absence of animated subjectivity in those expressions is not just a sign of some final discovery about the absence of human subjectivity in general in favor of merely corporeal bodies. That would be grossly simplistic. But something like the failure of the emerging historical world to allow for the realization of subjectivity in the only way it can become actual, corporeally or lived. Summarized one last time, I'm suggesting that Hegel is asking us to understand the social meaning of individual actions in the way he understands the historical and social dimensions of the production and appreciation of artworks. We're willing to concede, or at least more willing to concede in this case, that an artwork can be said to embody the artist's intentions, what she must have intended given what is there, in a way not tied necessarily to what explicit intentions the artist herself might have been able to formulate. And we understand that artworks mean what they do within the institution of art in society at a period. There's, of course, great commonality across epochs and societies. But we also struggle with historical works to understand what they meant at a time, in an age, as well as for us. I think it's clear that Hegel thinks of actions as also having such a public, performative, and so socio-historical dimension. Something like the realization of this is what turning the painting plane and the expressions of the depicted subjects so confrontationally toward the beholder raises as a new challenge. In this context, we might say that just to the extent that under new, rapidly changing historical conditions, we come to be more dubious, unsure, confused about the sense we make in seeing intentions in deeds, the less confident we are that we know how to do this, the less stable we might also expect the conventions governing pictorial success might be. The mark of this challenge and this difficulty is captured in those vacant looks in so many Manets and in many others, and in the implicit paradox that on the one hand, the subjects are looking at the beholder, but on the other hand, they seem to have no hope in a beholder of a response. They confront the beholder, but as if he or she were not there, as if they do not expect, could not now expect anything satisfying in return. By success in this gesture, I mean that the modernist equivalent to beauty as the promise of happiness is at least something like the vague promise of meaning, perhaps under ever more intense pressure. In these paintings, it's a promise that frames the painting, but is not, perhaps cannot be realized within such a frame. That appears to be the point. An apt name for what it means to fail to acknowledge and appreciate this situation properly is the one made such fruitful use of by Fried, Denis Diderot's theatricality, brilliantly exposed for the first time in his Rameau's Nephew. But Hegel himself, in his greatest failure, never seemed very concerned about this potential instability in the modern world, about citizens of the same ethical commonwealth potentially losing so much common ground and common confidence that a genuine irresolvability in any of these possible conflicts becomes ever more apparent, the kind of challenge and low expectations we see in all those vacant looks. As we've seen, he does not worry much because of his general theory about the gradual, actual historical achievement of some mutual recognitive status, a historical claim that has come to look as the least plausible aspect of Hegel's account, and that is connected with our resistance to his proclamations about art as a thing of the past. Since freedom, self-reconciliation in Hegel's expressive account, has to do with an ability to be able to see myself in my own deeds, experience them as legitimately mine, stand behind and defend them in a way that is acknowledged by others, a growing skepticism or uncertainty about being able to do this, even about the simplest self-understanding, might be expected to cast its skeptical shadow on various other forms of embodied expressions of human meaning. This is what it is to see what Hegel missed, but to see it in his terms, and to make use of that to understand the conditions in modern painterly meaning. Hegel's sense of the successful resolution of the question raised by trying to understand someone's deed, or by the question posed by a thousand-eyed Argos, has both a subjective and an objective side, both a way of understanding the provisional and unstable subjective side, the intention, motive, desire, or reason, a meaning actual only in the deed or the aesthetic object, and the objective social conditions of an age, especially the struggle for recognition inherent in social conflict and the ever more unstable interpretive conventions of modern societies. It's now generally acknowledged that Hegel's understanding of these objective social conditions was prematurely optimistic. But his account of what we need to take account of in understanding subjective intention and meaning, and his insistence on a link with objective historical conditions, remains a kind of modern fate, and one that needs to be set inside the later context of the fractured and prosaic character of the emerging industrialized, bourgeois, eventually consumerist nation-state world coming into view in Manet in the 19th century. We get an intuitive view of the result in different ways in 19th century painters after the beautiful. Thank you very much for all your attention.
Does your mic work?
I think so. It's on.
Λειτουργεί το μικρόφωνο του. Μπορεί να μιλάει και από εκεί, δηλαδή. Ναι.
It's on.
Okay, okay. Just one word. So thank you very much, Professor Pippin. Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this exquisite talk, so rich and so stimulating. And I have a host of questions, but I will, of course, withhold from interventions at the moment. So I would like to open the discussion.
Maybe I should stand up.
There are so many levels addressed in this talk that I can imagine there will be also many questions raised. So Stelios Ribidakis has a question.
Thank you so much for drawing our attention to Manet and to the emergence of modernism and using Hegelian approach to interpret this. May I ask you, would it be too much to ask you to just move forward to the heyday of modernism, I mean, in the 20th century, and I would like to ask you on this, whether you would be happy to accept the notion of art being a thing of the past in more central period of modernism, let's say, and with art turning conceptual. You've spoken a lot about pictorial intelligibility and the Argus face, the work of art, or the soul, the infinite soul. How would you think Hegel would respond to the loss of pictoriality or representationality altogether in 20th century? I'm asking you in a way to comment also on Dante's way of using Hegel to talk about a certain end of art or death of art as we know it in Hegelian terms, and I would like to ask you whether you think that Hegel might interpret what is happening in the 20th century as a kind of fulfillment or as a kind of realization of this idea of art turning conceptual completely. But then the question is, what happens to self-recognition, whether self-recognition is lost completely or dissolved or puzzled or whatever, and would this be too speculative to, to just try to do, just using Hegelian notions for modernism in the 20th century, conceptual art?
Yeah, no, that's
from Deschamps to Warhol,
Yeah, that's a huge question, and very appropriate to what I'm talking about, but I just find it really hard to frame an economical way of responding. Let me go all the way back to the essential paradox that emerges out of a historicist conception of art. Once you abandon an essentialist conception of art, something like Plato's or Kant's conception of the beautiful or Schiller's conception of the artistic or the aesthetic, once you abandon that conception and consider that art has an essentially historical nature, that it changes, essentially changes. What counts as art in a community changes essentially. You run the risk of inviting the speculation and perhaps the reality that art could become something that is, within the community at a historical time, accepted as something that no other community would recognize as art. That seems opened up by a historicist conception. Hegel would dispute that, but that's not the fundamental alternative. This is a more sort of theoretical response to your question. I'll get to Danto, whose position I completely reject, but I'll get to Danto in a minute. But I think the foundation of your question is, all right, well, you've introduced a Hegelian historical conception of the way art means as distinctly art in a community. Okay, fine. But can't it come to mean in a way that is unrecognizable to previous generations in historical time within a common tradition as art, become something completely different? People still call it art, but that's only a nominalist definition. It doesn't really have anything essential to do with what. Well, there's even a more fundamental level to that question. Philosophy is pure thinking. It's not an empirical discipline. It's not a historical discipline. It's a conceptual discipline. If there is philosophy, there is pure thinking, thinking unaided by empirical evidence. If there is philosophy, there can be thinking unaided by empirical evidence that reaches a result that is more successful than other attempts. There may not be philosophy. Many, many, many people believe that. There may not be philosophy. But if there is philosophy, it is a non-empirical discipline that can reach better or worse results in the attempt to figure out something substantive, like what is art? What is religion? What is the state? What is equality? What is freedom? What is justice? Those are non-empirical questions, and the one we're talking about is, what is art? The uniqueness of the Hegelian position is that you don't have to have a strict dualism between an essentialist and a historicist position. There can be something profoundly transformative in the historical fate of art, at the same time continuous. Okay, like what? The next question. Well, Hegel believes, again, as a result of pure thinking alone, philosophy, that there is a distinct sensual and affective modality of human intelligibility. The way we sensually experience and affectively feel is a form of intelligibility. And it's embodied in material objects, sounds, people walking around on the stage in front of us, celluloid or digital representation. It's embodied in an experiential mode that is uniquely, sensually, and affectively a modality of rendering intelligible as a component of historically evolving self-knowledge, as we understand that what it is to be human is to be a free being aspiring to mutually recognitive free status. All of that's tremendously controversial. You can reject all of this. I'm just trying to get to the point in which the premises are set for the rejection of Danto. If those premises are in place, then it's perfectly possible to say that what a community accepts as a gallery space full of artwork, say Joseph Beuys' clothing strewn around the floor, which after every exhibition the poor janitor cleans up and has to be reinstalled, and all the famous stories about Beuys. It's perfectly possible for Hegel to say, that is not art, any more than a community which sets itself up outside of the southwest of the United States as a peyote-smoking, rock and roll listening musical clan is a religion. They can call themselves whatever they want. It's not a religion. They can call themselves whatever they want. What we have in the United States as a federal government is not a state. It has nothing to do with being a state. It's a manipulative form of regulation for the sake of an elite of the modern organization of economic life. That's not a state. Absolutely not a state. It has nothing to do with a state. Calls itself a state. So the fact that Warhol could make Brillo boxes and set them out in a gallery has nothing to do with art. It has to do with Warhol being one of the cleverest showmen in the history of showmen. The fact that Danto uses Hegel to justify the claim that traditional art is over. He doesn't mean just conceptual. He means art is now whatever we say it is. It's a phrase of his. It's whatever anybody gets us to count as art. It's close to the George Dickey kind of social, conventional theory of art. It doesn't go quite that far, but I don't see why not, because he does believe that whatever the art world, that is the corrupt, capitalist, finance-driven investment community of New York City, determines to be artwork, the world that made Danto's career and made him a famous critic, is art. That's a corruption. You asked me what I think. I'm telling you what I think. I mean, I realize there is an argument here that we could have. By Hegelian, I'm just trying to get all the premises and assumptions and everything out to say this is a position that is loaded with defeasible claims, all the way back to the claim that philosophy is a matter of pure thinking, even though historical, even though it's its own time comprehended in thought. The pure thinking part comes with comprehended in thought. I'm sorry I'm going on too long, but you ask a very deep question. And I don't want to just say, oh, Danto's an idiot. I mean, he's a very smart man, and this is a very serious position, a very serious problem. That's what I would say.
And maybe in his last book, he somehow...
He sort of apologized a little bit. Yeah.
Changes a little bit.
Yeah.
It was so rich and wonderful, your question. Maybe it answered your answer. It would answer all the questions already.
I hope not.
Anticipated the question.
I hope not.
But I would like to
Oh, absolutely, yeah, sure.
to some other people as well who have already raised their hands. Paolo Colombo.
No, I have a truly practical question. You mentioned the hand of Olympia. And if you look at it again, it has the same structure of Christ being held by the angels, of the body of Christ.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Olympia.
So there it is.
Olympia.
Olympia. Not
Oh, Olympia.
Yeah?
Okay.
And look at Christ and the angels. You see his legs and their arms.
Come on, Christ and the angels.
It will come.
Yeah, I know. I'm just impatient.
Yeah. If you make a quick leap, you see...
I don't have any... You mean...
That's two fingers, and that's the other two fingers. Leaning on the thigh, which is the chair, the throne.
Here?
Yeah, no. The throne is Olympia's thigh, and the two legs correspond to two fingers,
Oh,
and the other two arms to other two fingers.
let's go see.
If you make a quick, if you're able to jump quickly, you'll...
I'm going the wrong way. I'm back to Olympia. Do I have that? Okay. It's hard to do this with jumping around like... I see what you're saying. Now, what does that mean?
I have no idea. I'm curious to know if this was painted... I'm not going to...
This is first.
This is first.
This is first.
Okay,
This is first.
Makes it...
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. I'll think about that.
Okay. So who was next? I can't see very well.
Well, I would like to go back to the basic categories of the Hegelian philosophy. And as you mentioned, the aim of the art is unveiling the truth. If this is the case, then what is the aim of the logic? And what is the relation between aesthetic and logic toward, between them and toward the relation of both toward the absolute, which is the basic category of the Hegelian philosophy?
God, such simple
you.
questions tonight. What is the role of the art in the understanding of the absolute? Well, as you know, from your question, I know you know, that Hegel's basic understanding of philosophy is systematic. Point one. Point two, the system is what he calls an encyclopedia. The encyclopedia has three parts. It has first a science of logic. He worked out in much greater detail starting in 1812, 1817, when he was teaching those poor high school students in Nuremberg and actually teaching them the book. I feel so sorry for those 18-year-olds struggling through the science of logic, which for 40 years I've been trying to understand. But it's really the first part of the encyclopedia, and let's say it's something like an account of all possible account givings, a category theory of the categories essential for the rendering of anything intelligible. Nature, human activity, artworks, everything. There is a general account of all account giving, a logic, all right? And then, according to Hegel,